whenever there are global wars, the big powers want to coerce the small nations. I don't know if you remember the Bush mantra after the Al-Qaeda attack. In his So even before Bush made that statement, for many years the global powers, whenever they are fighting, they want others to join them. That if you're not with them, you can't be in the middle. So the idea of the non-aligned movement is just to comfort those that are going to be in the middle. That it's okay, you can be there without allying with anybody, but don't start a fight that you don't know where it is starting, for which you don't know the original cause, and you don't even know how it is going to end and its ramifications. So I think it is important to look at the non-aligned movement from that perspective. It has never been consistent, and that is its nature. It's called strategic ambiguity. And I will take you back to the history. It started in 1961, and some of the founding fathers were Jawaharlal Nehru of India, Tito of Yugoslavia, Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt. In the 60s, when the Sino-India War broke out, Nehru, who voted for neutrality, decided to ally with the US to get its military support. Several years later, his daughter Indira Gandhi, when she became Prime Minister of India, she chose to ally with the Soviet Union, contrary to the philosophical foundations of the non-aligned movement. Again, early in the 70s, Gamal Abdel Nasser, founding member of the non-aligned movement, allied with the US. In fact, since then until today, Egypt has been an ally of the United States. I mean, that would be contrary to the founding principles of the non-aligned movement. But if you dig deeper, that it was never meant to be an organization that was going to take strong positions like NATO, like EU, like the G8. Never. It was a loose organization meant to comfort members that were not comfortable to join bandwagons of wars. So if that is the original non-aligned movement, you don't expect it to take a strong stance when it comes to the Ukraine war, because in any case, what can it do? It's a loose organization as it is, even if you go back to the original agreement. There are no ground rules that enjoin members to do certain things. NAM has no authority to sanction members for doing A, B, C, and D.
So does this have any relevance to the global issues that are moving on?
It has, if you appreciate its formation, that its relevance is to give comfort to its members and doesn't go beyond that. Secondly, it also offers some economic opportunities amongst members. So the moment you over-exaggerate its importance, when you over-exaggerate the importance of the non-aligned movement, then it will be a failure. But the moment you appreciate that from the beginning it's a loose coalition, a Marwa group of sorts, then its benefits ought to be appreciated using that yardstick.
Almost a club of small dictators in Africa who want to maintain their positions and discuss issues that suits their interests.
In fact, the African Union might even be stronger than the non-aligned movement, because it can send troops to Somalia. It can arbitrate in quite a number of conflicts, though it's weak. I'm not disputing the fact that the AU is weak, but in terms of implementation of some of its decisions, the AU is even stronger than the non-aligned movement.
Now, let us move on. When you look at this China, what do you think may be the interest of China and Russia in the non-aligned movement organization?
The interest is simple. Today, China is the second biggest economy. In other words, it's hegemonic contender number one. You have US as the hegemony, China is number two. When you go back to the hegemonic stability theory, whenever you have a superpower, according to that theory, there are countries that are struggling to displace it, and they are called hegemonic contenders. So China is hegemonic contender number one. So for it, the non-aligned movement offers an opportunity to reach out to these members to widen your sphere of influence as you struggle to displace the reigning hegemon. There are no tricks about it.
But do you think that also the presence of China and its interest there in the non-aligned movement, which may be economic-oriented, partly poses a major threat to the economic independence of these non-aligned movement? More so when you look at many of them running to Beijing for loans, which in one way or the other have failed to service, and they are into doesn't that weaken what would be the economic independence of these affiliate members of the non-aligned movement? Because already Washington has warned non-aligned movement members to be very careful with the debts, with the money.
Majority of the non-aligned movement members have been independent only in word and not in practice. They survive on grants and loans from the World Bank, the IMF, and we know who controls these Bretton Woods. It's not space science to know that majority of these members still survive economically on the global powers, either in the West or in the East. So what we see is another version of the scramble and partition of countries in the global South, be it in Asia, Africa, etc. It's just the scramble and partition, but in another form. So members of the non-aligned movement, if they were honest with themselves, would be thinking now of the second liberation. That we had an initial liberation where we chased away the white men. We now govern ourselves, but the people governing us are controlled by either people from the West or the East. So as the non-aligned movement sits, should be thinking about a second liberation. Because actually, if you want to talk about economic independence, you can't achieve it while running away from one donor to another. You can only talk about economic independence by thinking about self-sufficiency, self-sustenance, which doesn't seem to be the priority of the members as we speak.
Well, when we look at the theme of this year's Kampala Non-Aligned Movement Summit, talking about deepening their cooperation among affiliate member states, do you think that the 120 countries of the non-aligned movement organization have the capacity to address and find solutions to do with good governance in their member states, democracy issues, issues of refugees, climate change? Do you think they have that capability without the assistance of the West?
I think the non-aligned movement has no capacity to achieve most of the lofty ideals they talk about day in, day out. One of the challenges they have is that it is too wide a group. Too wide a group. I mean, it's like a United Nations of sorts. So you bring together members with ideas that are too distinct. That's where I started from. So in terms of economic approaches, military approaches, you can never have a universal agreement. You can never have a universal agreement. So success as a result of working together are usually much smaller. But how are you going to reach a universal agreement when you have 120 members? So that's where the problem starts. And I think it is better for them to admit that it is just a loose organization of members where you can sit, have a cup of coffee, a glass of wine. 2 or 3 members can have an opportunity to network. That's the only realistic thing you can get out of the non-aligned movement. But there's nothing you can get out of 120 members. What are you going to discuss conclusively? How and how?
Without the economic muscle.
You can't even even if there were no external interferences, there is no way you can reach an agreement. Because you see, the challenges of those from the Maghreb region in Africa and those in sub-Saharan Africa are different. The challenges of those from the Caribbean are different. The challenges of the members from Eastern Europe are different. The challenges of the members from Asia are totally different. So how? It's too wide a group to agree on smart objectives that can be achieved. That's the challenge with it.
Where does it leave the future of this club of 122 countries?
In fact, I consider it largely dead. And that's why I said, in 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, because the only time when the non-aligned movement seemed to be a little active was during the Cold War. And not that it was fighting either on the side of Soviet Union or on the side of the Western countries. No. But just it caucused and brought members together that were not comfortable to be allied to either of the conflicting sides. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, it virtually died. So what you're seeing today is an attempt to flog a dead horse. It would be better to agree that this is a loose organization. Even in a loose organization, there are many things you can benefit. There are benefits in many loose organizations, even in our individual capacities as people. There are many groups where we just sit in the evening and have a nice conversation, but it's beneficial in one way or the other. Somebody comes up with an idea of how he started a small business and you pick it up and you go and implement it. So I'm not saying that they are not, you can't have any benefits within the non-aligned movement. But for you to assume that you can achieve things that are achieved in SADC, in the EU, in NATO, is wishful thinking.
Well, moving away from that, Russia, we tackled slightly the interest of China. When you look at Russia's interest in this club that we are calling the Club of 122 countries, the non-aligned movement, into that non-aligned movement?
First, China, I have said, would want to use the non-aligned movement to widen its sphere of influence. First economically, then politically. Because you see, for you to become a superpower, economic might comes first. The US became the richest nation in the world, and it took it 70 years to become a superpower. So China has got a long way to go. It's economically number 2. So it would want to become the number 1 in terms of the economy.
We're talking about Russia.
That's China for one. Russia has many more problems. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, it struggled and struggled. But under Vladimir Putin, it has started to come back to the global stage. It has started to come back to the global stage. The challenge it has is for you to penetrate these members and widen your sphere of influence, you need to have some resources and some money, which money Russia doesn't have. Even before the outbreak of the Ukraine war, it doesn't have the money China has. It doesn't have the money that the United States has. So it becomes a little complicated, but it is also trying in small ways, but by engaging militarily and work.
Students are looking at Russia's interest in the non-aligned movement because these countries have been a bigger market for its arms dealing company, the Rosebone Export. They sell much of their military equipment to many of these countries in the Asia and in Africa.
Yeah, but it's not a market for only Russia. It's also a market for China. It's also a market for the United States. And majority of these countries are dealing with both countries. I mean, Egypt, in the lower part of the Middle East, is the biggest recipient of US military aid. But it also gets Russian military aid. And that's the nature of members of the non-aligned movement. For them, they say it's okay, we can deal with both. So I see it as a normal trend for Russia to continue to look for markets. Whenever an opportunity arises, Russia will seize it. And the non-aligned movement is one of those opportunities that Russia would want to seize to widen its sphere of influence.
Don't you think that Russia's the appetite for acquisition of military equipments from the non-aligned movement countries from Russia, and Russia's interest to further arm these countries poses a major threat to the West?
I think we also over-exaggerate the importance of Russia. Every time people today talking about Russia think they are talking about the Soviet Union. Are you aware that during this 1-year war, Russia had to look for drones from Iran, had to look for military equipment from North Korea? So it also needs the military hardware for its own survival. So it has no capacity to supply all these countries. It has no capacity to supply all these countries because you see, you don't have military companies that are dedicated to produce weapons the way you produce biscuits or sodas. In fact, that's why in countries like the US, a president has got executive authority to even divert some manufacturing companies in times of war, to move away from manufacturing whatever they are manufacturing to manufacture things that can assist in the war. Why? Because under normal circumstances, you can't keep manufacturing military weapons. And in many instances, these weapons are manufactured on order. So you order and it will take years for some of these weapons to be manufactured. So I think we shouldn't have exaggerated the importance of Russia. That it has stockpiles of weapons and it is stuck with them, it is looking for one to buy these weapons. In selling weapons, Russia is not only looking for money, but it is also looking for strategic alliances. That's one other benefit. So the benefit is not necessarily for just the market, but strategic alliances with these countries on the African continent, in Asia, and elsewhere for its geopolitical survival.
So in our last parting minutes, let us talk about the G77 plus China. Africa has a debt to China of close to 650 billion shillings. The West has kept on warning that China's investment in Africa is not sustainable, given their past experience. When the UK heavily, of course, had many of the colonies here, time came when it could not sustain its investments here and had to leave for the countries to take on their own independence. So do you buy into the analogy of the Western powers that China's investment in Africa so far, that stands at a debt of $65 billion, is not sustainable moving forward?
I don't think it's not sustainable on the part of China. China benefits a lot by extending loans to Africa. In fact, the benefits are huge. And its loans are more enticing to African leaders because they are not tied to things like human rights, democracy, corruption, etc. So I don't think that China is involved in a losing game. In my view, it is Africa which is losing by thinking that the loans from China are cheaper and have less restrictions. Yet in the long run, they are worse. My point is, Africa should be thinking about it's not necessarily a bad thing to get loans, because we know that even the US
indebted to China.
Is indebted to China. Even China is indebted to many other countries. But what kind of loans are you acquiring? And what do you use with those loans? I think it's the African, that's where the problem lies, especially on the African continent. The problem is not necessarily with the loans, but it is with the type of loans and what you do with the monies you've gotten from the Chinese banks. Once we sort that out, I think we would be able to put our houses to order.
Well, Dr. Samuel Kazibwe, thanks for being part of this interactive news segment where we discuss issues that affect the people, and we also host people of sound minds in the run-up to Uganda hosting the Non-Aligned Movement Summit in January next year, and the G77 plus China. Thanks for being part of the show.
My pleasure.
And we wish you the best of luck. To our viewers, have a good night.
Hello, our dear viewer and listener on the other side of radio and TV. We welcome you to this special edition of Non-Aligned Movement. We are still here as UBC, making it a point to inspire you, educate you, the people of Uganda, about Non-Aligned Movement and some of the things that have been